So what I want to do is to turn Robert Anton Wilson loose on you again. Only this time, remember that pleasant state we worked on this morning? Why don't you start in that one and then let him confuse you rather than doing it the same old way you did. So, Robert.
I don't know what there is about me and my works, but I was at a conference called the Prophets Conference a few months ago, which had a lot of distinguished people like Edgar Mitchell, the astronaut, John Mack of the Department of Psychiatry at Harvard, a whole bunch of distinguished people. They all got very polite applause. And when I come out, I got polite applause and Indian war whoops and rebel yells, just like I just got now. I seem to bring out the more unruly aspect of my audiences. I can't imagine why, because I'm such a conservative and quiet and mild-mannered person myself. Well, I mean, when the census taker came to the door, I didn't say, fuck you. I just said, go to hell. He said, but this is ordained by the Constitution. And I said, how do I know you're from the Census Bureau? He said, I'll show you my credentials. And he showed them to me, and I said, the CIA does better forgeries than that. And we batted that around for a while, and he went away. He came back a couple of weeks later and said, we just have 4 questions. We'd like it, just four. So I answered 3 of them, and the 4th one was, how much do I pay on my rent? I said, that's none of your fucking business, and I slammed the door in his face. And yeah, I'm sure he's going to be back a 3rd time. But I mean, when I'm not antagonized by government officials, I'm a very quiet, peaceable, law-abiding, gentle person. Although I do have a certain sympathy for Hannibal Lecter. You remember when Clarice asked him about the census, this case of the census taker? Hannibal's explanation was, he tried to quantify me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a big Chianti. Delicious. So if the census taker comes back a 3rd time, I already have my plans set. I just had lunch with Paul Krasner, who has the honor of being either the 1st or the 2nd person to ever publish me. My life is full of synchronicities, and on my 26th birthday, I came home from some shit job I had. I forget what it was. Something I was doing just to make a living until I could find some way to make a living as a writer, which took a long time. Anyway, on my 26th birthday, I pick up the mail out of the mailbox, come into the house, open it up, and there were 2 acceptance slips, one from Paul Krasner, who had accepted an article of mine called The Semantics of God, which he printed in his magazine, The Realist, and the other was from the James Joyce Review, which had just accepted an article of mine called Joyce and Taoism, which they printed in their summer 1959 edition. And I thought, boy, what an omen. On my birthday, I get my first 2 acceptances. I was told I got 2 articles going to be published. I'll have a book out by next year, I'm sure. Well, it didn't happen quite that fast. But anyway, I always remember how long I've known Paul. It's ever since my 26th birthday. Anyway, Paul asked me, he's doing an article about Ram Dass. I presume you all know who Ram Dass is. And he asked me if I had any good Ram Dass stories. And I said, oh, have I got a Ram Dass story for you? I decided it was so good I would share it with you, too. In 1964, I went up to Millbrook, which was then the center of the International Federation for Internal Freedom, IFIF, run by Dr. Timothy Leary, Dr. Richard Alpert, and Dr. Ralph Metzner. And they were engaged in trying to reproduce LSD effects without using the drug, because the drug research had just been stopped by the government. I did an interview with Leary, and after it was over, I went looking for my overcoat, and somebody said they put it upstairs on one of the beds on the 3rd floor. So I started tracking up the stairs to the 3rd floor. About halfway, I met Richard Alpert coming down with my overcoat in his hand. And I said, how did you know I was looking for my overcoat? And he got that real mystic look, which all Ram Dass fans know. He said, we have powers. So that left my head spinning for a couple of years, trying to figure out whether it was the way sound traveled in that kind of house, or did he really have psychic powers? Was I the victim of a joke or what? And I followed his career as I got to know Leary pretty well. Ram Dass I never saw again until the memorial service for Timothy Leary in Los Angeles right after his death. And Ram Dass and I were sitting right next to Nina Graboy, who was Leary's secretary in the 1960s. We were all going to speak at the memorial. And while somebody else was up there droning on about, everybody who speaks before me seems to be droning on, because I'm not listening to them. I'm thinking, what the hell am I going to say when it's my turn? Speakers never listen to other speakers. They're all worried about what they're going to say when it's their turn to face the audience. And I was thinking, boy, I'd really like a cup of coffee now, but if I got up and walked out while this fellow was speaking, he might be offended. Then suddenly I noticed Ram Dass had disappeared. He wasn't alongside of me anymore. And in a couple of minutes, Ram Dass reappeared doing the miraculous feat of carrying 3 cups of coffee in styrofoam cups. You know how hot those bastards are? He was carrying 3 of them, and he gave one to me, one to Nina, and took one for himself. And I said, how the hell did you know I wanted coffee? And he said, we have powers. That was a joke with a 30-year time delay on it. He has a sign over his computer which says, old dogs can learn new tricks. I think I'll get one like that and hang it over my computer too. Anyway, now that I'm through with my Ram Dass rap, we will proceed to the libretto, or the main theme, or whatever the hell I'm doing up here today. We were talking yesterday about how every nervous system creates its own reality tunnel, and no 2 of us are in the same reality. We think we are, but we're not. We're all in our own reality tunnel, which is why communication fails so often, and why most people are convinced that most other people are a little bit batty. The reason they seem a little bit batty is they have their own reality tunnel. I prefer the word reality tunnel, which was coined by Timothy Leary, although the same idea appears in every branch of social and behavioral science with different terminology. Sociologists generally refer to it as a glass. Anthropologists call it a culture. Krzyzewski called it a semantic environment. Whatever you want to call it, a neuro-linguistic system, a neurosemantic system, interprets all incoming signals to fit into a pre-existing structure of what we already believe. When we see something we can't believe, we generally have acute anxiety, and we begin to think, Jesus, I'm going crazy. Or we think, I didn't see it, I better look at it a second time. Maybe it won't be there the second time. And if we're lucky enough, it goes away and we can forget it. I once astounded a very dear old friend of mine in Chicago by saying, I don't know how we got onto this topic, but I just ventured, I see 3 UFOs a week. He was driving the car and he turned around and stared at me with a look that said clearly, oh my God, you really have gone nuts now. And I said, of course I see more UNFOs than UFOs. UFOs are unidentified flying objects. UNFOs, which is a term I created, is unidentified non-flying objects. I see at least 3 UFOs a week, and I see a couple of dozen UNFOs, unidentified non-flying objects, but that's because I'm not quick about identifying things. And I was speaking to the Irish Science Fiction Club in Dublin a few years ago, and in the question period, somebody asked me, do you believe in UFOs? And I said, of course. And instead of sitting down or asking another question, he burst forth with a long argument that all UFOs are sundogs or heat inversions, which has a lot of good meteorological evidence to support it, except for the fact that it only fits some UFO observations and not all of them. As far as I know, and I've been studying UFOs since the phenomenon started in the 40s, there is no theory that anybody has propounded so far that covers all UFO sightings. If you think they're extraterrestrials, You got to try to figure out why extraterrestrials would appear in Nazi uniforms to attack Betty and Barney Hill and then give them amnesia so they couldn't remember it except under hypnosis. And if you think they're all hallucinations, you got to explain why so many of them show up on radar. When did hallucinations start registering on radar? UFOs, as far as I'm concerned, are unidentified flying objects, which immediately brings us back to quantum mechanics, where we ended up yesterday. You can't separate the observer from the observation. Something becomes an identified object, flying or non-flying or whatever, by a process in the nervous system of the perceiver. Signals come in, and my body picks them up in various ways, mostly through sight, since we're very visually oriented. But we pick up all sorts of other signals from all over our body and our ears and all sorts of other more subtle senses. And if we can find a pre-existing image, we project it outward and we identify things. Oh, that's a chair. And then it bites us on the ass and we got to change it. Oh, that was a tiger that just looked like a chair. Anyway, after he was through with his pronunciation that all UFOs are sun dogs, and he sat down in triumph, I said, well, we agree. We both believe in UFOs. You think you know what they are, and I admit I don't know. Which really got him pissed off. Which was sort of like what happened at Phenomicon in Atlanta a few years ago. I was on a panel with Bill Cooper, a guy who claims to be, or was, or claims to be a former naval intelligence agent, who alleges that he saw secret documents about the treaty between Eisenhower and the extraterrestrials, which allowed them to conduct research on this planet in exchange for giving the United States advanced technology, which would put us ahead of the Soviet Union in the arms race. This legend, fact, myth, whatever you want to class it, this has been going around in UFO circles for many years. Bill Cooper is one of about 12 people who claim to have seen the actual papers of the treaty. All of the others also allege that they're former intelligence agents, and all of them have been denounced as charlatans and frauds by their critics. Without trying to decide on that very difficult issue, while I was on this panel, a dispute broke out between a panelist and a woman in the audience about a UFO that had appeared over Atlanta a few weeks before the convention. And the woman on the panel said it was close enough to her building that through her window with binoculars she could clearly identify it as a Goodyear blimp. The woman in the audience jumped up and started yelling, it was close enough to my building, I could see very clearly it was a oval-shaped craft with portholes with little green men looking out through the portholes. And while they were busy shouting at each other, and various groups in the audience were shouting at each other, after a little silence reigned, I said, well, this illustrates what I've been saying all along. Every nervous system creates its own reality tunnel. Something was hanging in the air over Atlanta. This woman classified it in her nervous system as a Goodyear blimp, and this woman classified it as a spaceship with little green men looking out the portholes. The non-verbal event remains beyond all of our categories because we can't bring it back and examine it scientifically, so we'll never know what it really was. Boy, did both sides hate my guts. People are always in a hurry to identify things. Well, that's because this still remains basically an Aristotelian culture. And the first law of Aristotle's logic is A, which means I am what I am, as Popeye would say. A thing is what it is. Now, anybody who has spent more than about 40 years on this planet has observed that nothing is what it is. Everything is changing all the time. I assure you, I do not look anything like I did in my 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, I did not look anything like I looked 20 years before that. Well, for that matter, this hotel probably doesn't look anything like it did 20 years ago. It may not have even been here 20 years ago. Everything is changing all the time. Some things are changing at faster rates than others. When I was very young, I worked in the corrosion department of a large engineering firm. And the first law of corrosion is you can't stop it. The second law is you can slow it down. And the whole function of the corrosion engineering department of a large engineering firm is to slow down the corrosion of everything they build, because you can't stop it. Everything corrodes eventually. Everybody I've ever known, well, not everybody, how should I phrase? Everybody born before 1800 is dead by now. That's the most dramatic form of change you can think of. One day somebody's alive, the next day they're dead. People who aren't dead certainly don't look like they looked in 1800. In 1800, they looked like a bunch of genes running around in God knows whose chromosome systems. That would be their great-great-great-grandparents, I suppose. Somehow these genes migrated in space and time so that two people carrying these genes got together, had a good, let's hope a good, happy fuck, and this person somehow miraculously appeared, looking nothing like the genes and nothing like the carriers of the genes. For instance, nowadays, every statement you make, you got to put modifications on it because of the way science is accelerating. But by and large, in spite of the recent advances in genetic engineering and bioengineering, etc., I assume everybody here had two biological parents. Is there anybody here who had more than two biological parents? Well, it's getting more and more common for people to have 3 or 4 biological parents. Okay, you all had 2 biological parents. How many grandparents does that give you? How many great-grandparents? Okay, so let's go back to the time of Christ. That's 70 generations ago. How many ancestors did you have at the time of Christ? I'll give you a few minutes to work it out in your heads. You disappoint me. I was sure somebody in the audience would have a calculator and give me the answer in 30 seconds. You're all working on it in your heads? Have you got back to 1800 yet? Have you got back to 1600? What? Okay, we'll accept that. I think the answer is somewhere around 15 trillion, but I don't remember exactly. Now that's more than the number of people on the Earth at that time, more than the number of people on the Earth right now even. Now how many of them can you really swear to the good character of? How many of them do you know the race of? How many of them do you know were black, white, Hawaiian, Oriental? How many of them were Jewish? How many of them were Goys? You don't know. We are descended from unknown ancestors, and all we know is a few generations back, and we identify ourselves with that few generations. The point of trying to figure out how many ancestors we had at the time of Christ was not only to get you used to thinking in terms of exponential functions, but remember when we did our information exegesis a few days ago, we found out that from the time of Christ to the present, information has been doubling faster and faster. The first doubling took 1,500 years, the next 250, the next 150, the next 50, the next 10, the next 7, the next 6. At the end of the 80s, Jacques Vallée calculated that information was doubling every 18 months. By now, it's certainly doubling faster than every year. And so that is approaching the kind of high, one with a lot of zeros after it. That would be the number of ancestors you had at the time of Christ. By the way, the number of ancestors you had at the time of Christ, since that's bigger than the whole population of the world at that time or now, that means most of us had ancestors in common whether we know it or not, which is truly an astonishing thought when you stop to think about it. All wars are wars between brothers and sisters. Isn't that crazy? As a matter of fact, an amateur genealogist who seems to have qualifications in the field and know what he is doing offered to study the genealogies of myself and my wife Orlin while we were living in Ireland. He was an Irishman, and he studied the history of the Rileys, my wife's family, and the O'Loughlin's, my grandmother's family. And it turned out both of us, the O'Reillys and the O'Loughlyns, were descended from a Danish, among many others, from a Danish pirate named Olaf the Black, who called that because he had black hair and most Danes had blonde hair. And he seized the Isle of Man around the year 500 of the Christian era, and made himself king of the Isle of Man, and every ship going between Ireland and England, or between England and Ireland, had to pay a toll to him. And so he was a real government because he could collect taxes, and he called himself the king. So our marriage was incestuous to the 1 to the 7 millionth, 70 billionth degree, or something like that. But so are all marriages. Isn't that a rather astounding thought? Olaf the Black had a grandson named Lachlan Moore, who I'm either descended from him or from one of his slaves. You can't tell when you get into genealogy because the slaves all had the names of their owner. So I'm either descended from the Lachlan Moore, king of Kerry, or from one of the slaves of Lachlan Moore, king of Kerry. Now, do you know what Lachlan Moore means in Gaelic? It means Great Dane. So I hope he didn't lead a dog's life. Anyway, now that we've got our heads full of big numbers, I would like to try a very simple exercise. I would rather like the description of the pool, only this time we're going to use sound. I would like everybody, when I say go, to close your eyes, and then I will rush through the audience, picking everybody's pockets. No, I won't do that. Besides, that joke doesn't work anymore. You all know I can't do that in my present condition. But anyway, I want you to close your eyes when I say go and see how many different sounds you hear between the time I say go and the time I say stop. Does everybody understand that? Is that clear? Does that require further explanation? You all know what I want? You all agree to do it? Ah, good, a nice docile audience. No rebels. Okay. Go. Stop. Okay. How did I do that? We have powers. Okay, how many people could identify more than 20 distinct sounds? More than 30? Not the same one as yesterday with the pool, is it? You put your hand down. You can remember 30 distinct sounds? What? 22? You got 22 also? Anybody go for 23? Okay, 22. We'll let you go since you didn't have a chance yesterday. Hey, no jacking off during the class.
I heard papers rustle once, twice, 3 times, 4 times from over here. I heard shifting in the chair, which sounded like shifting to the left. I heard shifting to the right. I heard in the back what sounded like a little tiny crinkling of paper. I heard the air conditioning unit inside. I heard the hum coming from the electronic equipment. I heard the hum coming from the lights inside. I heard something happen twice in the building that sounds a lot like an ice maker releasing ice, but I'm not exactly sure. But I heard that twice, so I counted that twice. I don't know if that's cheating or not. But, I heard someone slightly, ever so slightly clear their throat. I heard someone swallow. I heard someone. I don't know where I'm up to now. I'm gonna. Maybe it wasn't masturbating. Oh, there you go. I heard someone make a chair creak as if they were leaning back on it. Might have been from over here. I heard someone doing something with what could have been something around their head because it was kind of coming from this level. It sounded like maybe the earphones, maybe not. I heard my own necklace and the chain from this little thing that has around it. I heard the sound of my own breathing. How many is that? Any count?
You're over 20. I was up to 13. And you did a lot of options.
Just trying to think of anything else.
Well, that sounded like 22. That's not a lot, approximately 22. And now we repeat the same exercise as we did with the pool. Everybody who heard sounds that she didn't hear, hold your hands up real high. Everybody look around and see what's going on. You see, it doesn't just apply with memory of places like a swimming pool. It applies in the very instant you're living in. Every nervous system is creating its own reality tunnel. We do it with sound, we do it with sight, we do it with our interpretation of other people's body language. We do it on all levels. We're continually creating our own reality tunnel. And unless we recognize this, most of the time it seems other people are being deliberately stupid or crazy or something because they're not in the same world with us. Once you begin to recognize that every nervous system creates its own reality tunnel, you get a lot more tolerant and more willing to listen to other people, because consider if we had taken a poll of the whole class and put in all the sounds that she left out, we probably would have, well, let's do that as a matter of fact. Everybody who heard a sound she didn't, all the sounds that she left out, we probably would have, well, let's do that as a matter of fact. Everybody who heard a sound she didn't hear, let's start and move around the class, starting with the first row and going on. Everybody heard a sound she didn't report, tell us about it. Okay? Okay. Door closed? Okay. Heard, oh, yeah, well, she didn't hear you breathing. Yeah. That's right. That's absolutely true. Elevator? Two noises from outside. Next row. No, she reported that one. Your watch ticking. Okay. Okay. A lot of breathing going on in this room. Wow.
I just heard my own internal music loading 7.
Yeah, it's after lunch. A lot of people. I expected a lot of people would report their own stomachs making digestive noises. By the way, we're up to 15 already.
I heard a truck that comes that direction out there.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Just sounded like pants rushing.
Third row. Hello, are you here?
I heard electronic beep.
An electronic beep.
I heard the same like
Well, let's see. We'll count that as we're up to 17 now. I think we're counting the electronic beep only once. At least I hope so. Maybe it was 2 electronic beeps. We'll make it 18. Anybody else? Okay, we got 26. We what? 26 more after the 22 we got from the class's observation champion. Let's give her a round of applause, by the way, for being a champion. But please note that although she heard more than anybody else in the room, the sum total of the room heard more than she did, which indicates the value of communication and the whole neuro-linguistic process. Because we can communicate, because we have human language, we can send each other signals and messages about all sorts of things. And every time we open ourselves up to free communication from wherever it's coming from, every time you surf the net, for instance, just at random, just picking things out to see what you might find, you're taking in loads and loads of information you normally wouldn't encounter. Now, there's a book out called Non-Zero by Robert Wright, which argues that evolution from the beginning has been moving toward the level where there are more and more winners and less losers. That is to say, cooperation proves to be a more successful survival strategy than competition. We're moving from zero-sum games to non-zero-sum games, and he tracks this from the beginning of evolution with a tremendous acceleration after the appearance of human speech, and he predicts a much greater acceleration now that we've got internet. Now, if communication has all this value for us, we can all double our knowledge just by opening our minds and listening to what other people have to say. And if internet makes it possible for us to hear from more people than we ever could hear from before, we have this tremendous learning opportunity before us. And 2 things stand in the way: our belief systems, which I abbreviate BS, and censorship. Belief systems prevent us from receiving signals from certain people because we believe they have nothing to say that we need to listen to. Every group in the world believes there are some people whose signals they don't have to pay any attention to. Right now, the majority of the medical community believes that Dr. Duesberg and the other heretics about AIDS research are a group they don't have to listen to. As a matter of fact, one of the orthodox AIDS authorities has suggested they should all be put in prison as a public menace for creating confusion. Somebody else has suggested they should all be shot. Back in the 1950s, Wilhelm Reich was doing research which the United States government not only didn't want to listen to, it didn't want anybody else to listen to either. So they collected all of Dr. Reich's books, took them to the Vandervoort Street incinerator in New York and burned them all. Then they went to Reich's laboratory in Rangeley, Maine, and smashed all of his scientific equipment with axes, and then they threw his ass in jail, where he promptly died of a heart attack within a year and a half. Now, my basic position for the last 40 years or so has been that communication is always good and blocking communication is always bad. because the more signals we receive, the bigger our map of the world gets. The bigger our map of the world gets, the more we can predict. The smaller our map gets and the more we lock out, the more likely it is that we're going to be living in some kind of bigoted trance in which we're ignoring facts that are singularly important to us. And I think if you look back over history, most of the wars, religious persecutions, crusades, inquisitions, pogroms, all of this resulted from people thinking they knew enough already that there was a whole group of people they didn't need to hear anything more from, so let's shut them up. And the techniques of shutting them up varied from burning them at the stake to locking them in prison to burning their books to putting them in concentration camps, etc. None of this seems to have contributed one jot to human progress. It seems to be the most shameful part of the human historical record. And I think most people nowadays have a rather low opinion of one another and of human beings in general, just because of this history of bigotry and intolerance. And yet if we stop to think for a minute about that simple exercise I just led you in, it is very obvious that the more signals you're willing to receive, the more you know about the environment you live in. If you know nothing about the environment, imagine if you knew nothing at all about the environment you live in. You couldn't walk 3 steps without bumping into something. You couldn't hear what anybody was telling you. I mean, you'd be in really sad shape if you shut off all signals. The question is, how many signals are you shutting off right now that would be valuable for you to receive? I don't know. But in general, I think it's a good idea to try to receive more and more signals from more and more sources, which is why I probably rank as the world's #1 internet fan. I'm fascinated by all the signals you can get over internet that you could never get over any previous media of communication. And of course, aside from belief systems, then there is censorship. I think I already expressed myself about that yesterday, quoting Justice Hugo Black. Did I quote that? Did I do that yesterday, or was I in a conversation with somebody else on it? Well, I'll quote it again. The Constitution says there shall be no laws abridging freedom of speech or of the press. Some of my learned colleagues have created arguments so ingenious that they almost convince me that no laws mean some laws. But I am a simple farm boy at heart, and to me no laws in English seems to mean no laws. Now, a lot of other justices have voted taking a liberal stand on free speech issues. Nobody ever stated it as clearly as Black, and he was generally known as a conservative. He was known as a conservative until he voted the wrong way on some issues, and the conservatives got all pissed off at him. But his attitude was the Constitution was such a magnificent document that we shouldn't fuck around with it, especially on something like free speech. Of course, the Constitution has its defects, but as I keep saying, it's better than the system we've got now since the Tsar took over. Now, I would like to try another experiment in perception. During that exercise, from the time I said stop until the time I said, I just lost another synapse. At my age, they're going faster all the time. Oh, well, there's recent research indicates new synapses are replacing them. Alzheimer's is not caused by old age, it's caused by something else. Yeah, well, you don't lose your synapses, you lose some synapses and grow new ones. So when a synapse fails and I say the wrong thing, I no longer feel terrified. Oh my God, Alzheimer's is setting in. Oh, well, that synapse is gone, but I'll grow another one by tomorrow. Anyway, from the time I said not stop, but start, until the time I said stop, how much time do you think elapsed? And this time I think I would like to go around the whole room with everybody speaking up without my pointing at you. We'll start at that end of that row and then move to the next row, and because there's something strange about the seating about 4 rows back, I'm not going to be pointing because I don't know who's in the 4th row and who's in the 5th. So it's up to you to arrange that for yourself. I think you all know where you're sitting in relation to one another. So we'll just go around the room, and please try not to be influenced by what the person before you said. Give me your own honest estimate. How long do you think that exercise took?
4 minutes, 7 seconds.
1 minute, 7 seconds?
1 minute,
1 minute,
2 minutes,
2 minutes,
1 minute.
2.5.
45 seconds?
Okay, so we now have a range from 45 seconds to 2.5 minutes. Let's see how we do with the rest of the class. One minute.
Just divide the numbers. 1 minute. 1 minute.
2 minutes and 9 seconds.
40 seconds.
40, that's lower than the 45 we had before.
1 minute, 28 seconds. 45 seconds.
8 minutes? I think some of you are trying to kid me, but you really think 8 minutes? Okay. Okay, I'm not going to argue. What?
62 seconds.
I was a deep trance, so it could have been 1 minute or it could have been 20 minutes.
Thank you for your honesty. What? Hmm? Oh, you just heard. I think the lowest estimate we got was 30 seconds, right? And the highest we got was 4 minutes, except for 8 minutes, yes. So the exercise took 30 seconds for some of you and 8 minutes for others, and the chap in the back there was in trance and doesn't know whether it was 1 minute or 20 minutes. Now, at this point, somebody usually demands that I tell them how long it really was, and the answer is it really was what you experienced. Are you going to have more faith in a goddamn piece of machinery than you got in your own nervous system? You know how much time you experienced. I lived in Ireland for 6 years. I suppose I mentioned that before. You might say I still live in Ireland mentally, even though physiologically I'm in this country. My wife and I noticed a strange thing about Dublin. You never see two clocks that agree. There's always at least a 20-minute difference, except in the summer when the difference runs between an hour and 20 minutes and an hour and 2 hours. This is because they have daylight savings time. But most Dublin merchants don't believe in doing anything the government tells them, so they don't set their clocks back when they're supposed to, so you get an even bigger spread in the summer. But even in the winter, you get a spread of at least 20 minutes between any two clocks. In Cork, which is the capital of the province, no, I don't know, it's never mind. Cork is a big city in central Ireland. They have, the city hall has 4 clocks facing the 4 quarters, and they never agree. They always disagree by at least 10 minutes, usually by 20 minutes, like Dublin. And people in Cork call them the 4 liars. By the way, according to Dublin repute, a Cork man is a Kerry man in human form, in case you have any doubt about that. Now, we not only remember a swimming pool differently and hear sounds differently, but we estimate time differently. We are creating our reality tunnel in multiple dimensions and multiple levels of complexity all the time, and we never take credit for it. I'm continually astonished at the modesty of people who invent elaborate and complex conspiracy theories, for instance, about aliens from outer space who well, according to a widespread belief in this country, somewhere in a galaxy far, far away, that every now and then these extraterrestrials get into some particularly vicious controlled substances, and when they're really flying, one of them says, "Hey, let's get into the flying saucer, zoom across 5 billion light years, land on Earth and have another go at Whitley Strieber's ass." And they all hop in the spaceship and off they go. And that's part of the reality tunnel of a lot of people. We all have our own BS, our own belief systems, And the chief rules for sanity that I have managed to formulate in 68 years of wandering around this benighted, primitive, and rather paranoid planet is, don't ever fully accept anybody else's BS. And the second rule is like unto the first, don't ever accept your own BS fully. Your own belief system always needs revision. Buckminster Fuller put it this way: universe is non-simultaneously apprehended. That is such a profound statement that I'm going to repeat it again. Universe is non-simultaneously apprehended. That follows from Einstein's special relativity and general relativity. It also follows from common sense and ordinary observation, if you stop and think about it. You have never comprehended, apprehended, introjected, perceived, conceived the universe all at once. You perceive cross-sections. If you're very aware, you're perceiving in nanoseconds maybe, like in very deep meditation or trance. If you're less aware, you're perceiving minute by minute. If you're trapped in a belief system, you're not perceiving anything anymore except your own belief system. But the universe itself is non-simultaneous. We apprehend it non-simultaneously. My apprehension of universe today is not my apprehension of universe yesterday. And as a matter of fact, if you've had some experience with Zen Buddhism, you get to the state, I don't claim to be a Zen adept at all, please don't misunderstand me, but I had a little practice of Zen, and I have discovered my universe can change rapidly from second to second. If you turn on your nervous system fully, you become aware of so much more that you got to revise your map of the universe continually. So universe is non-simultaneously apprehended. Any belief system you have, you better beware of, because if you believe in your BS too strongly, it's going to be cutting off all the new signals coming in. You'll get more and more detached from reality. You'll know less and less of what's really going on. And the next thing is you might land in Congress. This has been known to happen. There's another theory about why we all live in different times, which I think I ought to quote for the sake of fairness and comparison, which I learned from William S. Burroughs, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. Burroughs was living in Tangier, and he got up one morning, had a little breakfast, wrote a letter, went down to American Express, mailed the letter, saw a friend, stopped off, had a cup of coffee with the friend, chatted for a while, came home, and it was 4 p.m. And Burroughs asked himself, where the hell did the whole day go? What happened to the whole day? And he sat down and thought about it. He decided the short time mob had moved in on Tangier. The short time mob are one of a group of extraterrestrial invaders who inhabit Burroughs' fiction, and apparently inhabit his nervous system too, because it's very hard to distinguish Burroughs' fiction from his nonfiction. I don't think Burroughs believed there was such a distinction anyway. The short time mob steals people's time from them. If you're not paying attention all the time, if you're not receiving as many signals as you possibly can, if you're not sucking in information from the environment every way you can, if you're a little bit out of touch, the short time mob grabs a few seconds here, a few minutes there. If you're really out of touch, they grab a whole hour away from you. Suddenly it's 4 p.m, you don't know where the whole day went. So beware of the short time mob. Pay attention. There was a Zen master who was asked, what is Zen really all about? And he said, attention. And the student asked, could you give me one word more? I can't make enough out of that one word. And the Zen master said, attention. And the student said, I beg your humble pardon, but could you give me just a little bit more of a hint? And the Zen master said, it's very simple. Attention means attention. Which is why in Aldous Huxley's novel, the enlightened ruler of that island, Huxley's novel Island, the enlightened ruler, has trained thousands and thousands of minor birds to repeat the one word, attention. And then he released them, so they're flying all over the island. And no matter where you are on the island, no matter what you're doing, every couple of minutes you hear a minor bird yelling, attention, attention, which sort of keeps people on the qui-vive and keeps them from getting trapped in their own BS or somebody else's BS. Beware of BS. Beware of belief systems. Now I think it's time for a break. Would you all agree it's time for a break? And I can't even remember the bastard's name. Cheney. Oh. Now, if he had a sense of humor, he would have picked Markov Cheney. Markov Cheney is a character in 6 of my novels, one of my favorite characters. Anyway, we got a Cheney, even if it's not Markov Cheney or Lon Cheney or Lon Cheney Jr. Everybody else seems to have kind of missed out, too, because a Concorde jet crashed, and Clinton called a news conference to announce that the Camp David Accords had failed. Now, I think Clinton acted with malice aforethought to steal the headlines from George Bush. I don't think anybody sabotaged the Concorde just to screw over George. George does a good enough job screwing himself over every time he opens his mouth. But I just thought we'd make brief contacts with consensus reality. In consensus reality, it makes a big difference whether Bush or Gore gets elected. And many people are passionately involved in campaigning for one or the other of the two lying bastards. From my point of view, it doesn't make any more difference than who wins the Miss America contest. All I know for sure is whoever wins the Miss America contest, she's going to have an overbite. They always do. I don't know why. But nobody ever wins the Miss America contest unless she has an overbite. Have you ever noticed that? They all do. And 85% of them are blonde, which is very strange because according to genetics, only 15% of the population are blonde. I think some are born blonde, some achieve blondness, and some have blondness thrust upon them, to quote the immortal bard. Some have blondness thrust upon them. I used to vote when I lived in New York and was young. I used to vote every year for Miss Rheingold. She was the queen of a beer company. She was their advertising symbol for the year. And God knows why I bothered voting for that. But I guess I just wanted to make my opinion felt somewhere or other. But I've never been able to feel that way about politicians. As Raymond Chandler said, I don't care who's president, whoever he is, he's going to be a politician. And that sort of sums up the whole situation. How do you choose between politicians? That's like choosing between boa constrictors. I mean, suppose you had 5 boa constrictors in the room. Which one would you rather have devour you? Some people think my opinions about politics and government are rather extreme. Sometimes I think so myself. So I'd like to quote 3 inflammatory anarchist statements at you and see if you can identify the sources. The first one I'm going to heave at you: government is not reason, it is not persuasion, it is force. Capital F, capital O, capital R, capital C, capital E. This guy really wanted to emphasize that. Government is not reason, it is not persuasion, it is force. Like fire, it is a treacherous servant and a dangerous master. Now, who do you think said that? Bakunin, Kropotkin? Which crazy Russian anarchist said that? Well, that was George Washington, the first president of the United States and one of the foremost hemp growers of his time. George wrote a letter to his gardener: make the most of the Indian hemp and plant it all again next year. He wrote to Sir John Sinclair, I find the Indian hemp a true curiosity. It's great. You should be encouraged. Oh, well, I'm wandering from the topic again. I'm giving you other quotes from George. But while I'm wandering, I mentioned a while ago I had lunch with Paul Krasner, who was one of the first 2 people to accept an article by me, one of the first 2 editors in the whole world deranged and demented enough to accept my rantings as fit for print. And the article I wrote that got into Paul's magazine, The Realist, in 1959 was called The Semantics of God. And in that article, I raised the question, does God have a willy? Now, this does not seem very shocking today, but this was quite a while before women's liberation appeared at the 1969 New Congress Forum. Everybody assumed that God did have a willy at the time I was writing. But I asked, does God have a willy? And if so, how big would it be? Would it be bigger than King Kong's? I assumed it would not be bigger than King Kong's, on the ground that when King Kong walks through the forest, he keeps knocking trees over. He's so goddamn enormous, he can't get through that jungle at all without knocking over 5 trees every time he moves. Whereas in Genesis, God walks through the Garden of Eden in the afternoon, and there's no reference to him knocking any trees over. Ergo, King Kong was bigger than God. So if we assume that penis size is somehow related to body size, then King Kong had a bigger willy than God, if we assume God was male, which I didn't assume. In my article, The Semantics of God, I asked whether if God has a willy, and if not, should we refer to God as he, she, or it? Now, I would have become one of the prophets and maybe even one of the heroes of the feminist movement if I had decided on she. Unfortunately, I decided on it. I said I couldn't imagine a God with a genital organ. As a matter of fact, it's hard enough for me to imagine a God of any sort, but I can imagine some kind of intelligence system reigning throughout the cosmos in some sense or other. But yeah, I'll continue digressing. Why not? That's what I'm paid for. After contemplating the question profoundly for a number of decades, I have concluded that intelligence exists on every level that I am capable of understanding or perceiving, or think I understand or think I perceive. I see intelligence in dogs tremendously. I see intelligence in ants, although it's harder to notice there. You got to watch for a while before you... Most of the time, ants seem to be wandering around drunk, you know. They don't seem to know where they're going or what they're doing. They pick something up, they carry it for 5 feet, they drop it, and they wander off and do something else. But you can see intelligence in ants, you can see intelligence in I think intelligence is a hierarchy, and the idea that we're at the very top of the hierarchy may be as naive as the idea that we were at the center of the universe. The word China means the Middle Kingdom, which means the middle of the world. The ancient Israelites believed they lived in the center of the world. I think the Greeks thought so too. Everybody thought the world was flat and they were living right in the middle of it. And then we got to the spherical Earth theory. Well, at least the Earth is the center of the universe. Everything revolves around the Earth. You can see that very clearly by looking at the sky every night. You see the things are moving all the time. The stars are not in the same place. The planets are not in the same. Obviously, they were all revolving around the Earth. Until Copernicus came along and pointed out it's mathematically simpler to assume the Earth is moving around the sun. And then Giordano Bruno came along and said the center is everywhere, that everything in the universe is the center of everything else. Looked at from that perspective, he was sort of a forerunner of Einstein. And internet. In internet, everybody with a computer is the center of their own universe. Anyway, the idea that we're at the top of at the intelligence level in the universe seems to me probably just as naive as the idea that we're at the center of the universe. I imagine a hierarchy of intelligences, and at that point my mind stops. I don't know if the hierarchy is plural or unified in some sense I can't understand, or if it's plural and in a hierarchical sense that culminates in a unity at the top. I regard all those questions as utterly beyond my comprehension, and I have a very sincere admiration for the people who think they can answer it. The same sort of admiration I have for the kind of people who think they can answer how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. But whatever kind of intelligence permeates the universe on all levels, from the ant to the dog to the human to the people from Sirius who started communicating with me on the Monica Lewinsky's birthday. So we'd both be prepared to play our historical roles in the later 20th century. Fred Hoyle in Evolution from Space argues that the DNA molecule is too complicated to have happened by accident, which actually, well, first Sir Francis Crick argued that first. Sir Francis Crick, one of the two people who won the Nobel Prize for describing the shape of the DNA, along with Dr. James Watson, there was a woman involved too named Rosalind. Anybody know her last name? You see what a sexist society we live in. She did the electronic microscope work that confirmed Crick and Watson. Well, she didn't get the Nobel Prize. Another synapse gone. It's like Sister Kenny. The first time I had polio, I was cured by the Sister Kenny method. My parents, by sheer good luck, found the one doctor in New York who was using the Sister Kenny method. If they hadn't found him, I would have been paralyzed all my life. As it is, I spent 64 years walking around like an ordinary human being, even though, according to contemporary medical theory, half of the muscles in my legs were dead all the time. The other half were working overtime to compensate, which is why I am now temporarily in a wheelchair, because the muscles got worn out, the ones that were still alive trying to take up the job of the ones that were dead. Anyway, I was cured by the Sister Kenny method, and I often wondered why it took so long for the American Medical Association to accept the Sister Kenny method, why my parents had, by sheer blind luck or divine guidance or some inexplicable phenomenon, they found the one doctor in New York, maybe the one doctor in the United States, for all I know, who was using the Sister Kenny method. It was not officially accepted by the AMA until the mid-1940s. I was cured by the Sister Kenny method in 1936, which was he was a heretic, that doctor. And all I remember about him was his name was Dr. Adams. I don't even remember his first name. As far as I can make out, the only reason Sister Kenny's method took so long to be accepted, she was curing people all over Australia. But Australia is down under, which is where hell is supposed to be, so we don't want to receive any information from there, right? The AMA rejected her work for 6 years. And as far as I can make out, the main reasons are nurses are not supposed to make discoveries. Only doctors are supposed to make discoveries. A nurse has no right to make an important discovery, and if she did, it couldn't possibly be true. And the second reason was she didn't have a willy. That goes back to whether God has a willy or not. We're still dominated by this ancient Mediterranean fertility cult where the willy is the center of all magic. Throughout most of history, women in childbirth were assisted by other women known as midwives, or in one pronunciation, midwives. Whether you want to pronounce it midwife or midwife, it was women who assisted other women, which makes sense. Who knows more about childbirth than women? We live in a society in which that is now a heresy, fighting desperately to make a comeback, because we believe only somebody with a willy can supervise childbirth, so it has to be a male doctor. My wife had 4 children, and she has an opinion of obstetricians lower than my opinion of politicians. But they have willies, so they have the authority. Anyway, I think Sister Kenny, besides being a nurse and a woman, she was an Australian too, and who can take anything that comes out of Australia seriously? As far as the rest of the world knows, all Australia ever produced was kangaroos and Crocodile Dundee. What? Foster's beer. Oh, I gotta try that someday. I never even heard of it. You see what I mean about Australia? Now that we've digressed far enough, we go back where we started to this viciously subversive anarchist quote: "Government is not persuasion, it is not reason, it is force. Like fire, it is a treacherous servant and a dangerous master." George Washington, plantation owner, hemp grower, and revolutionary. Can you imagine this country has a bunch of revolutionaries as heroes? Anybody who tries to start a revolution nowadays gets his ass in jail. The people who started a revolution 200 years ago are heroes. It's all a matter of timing, you see. As Alan Alda said, comedy is tragedy plus time. Patriotism is treason plus time. From the British point of view, Washington and his cohorts were all traitors. My second quote from a viciously anarchist persuasion runs as follows: absolute power is the same whether in a single monarch, an oligarchy, or the majority of a democratic parliament, equally bloody, diabolical, and in every respect to be feared and abhorred. Kropotkin, Bakunin, Malatesta, Proudhon. Which vicious anarchist was that? That was John Adams, our second president. John Adams distrusted government so much that he is the major architect of the system of checks and balances in our Constitution. The Constitution is a document that used to govern this country. You'll find it in the back of most dictionaries as a historical curiosity, so you can find out what this government used to be like before the Tsarists took over, before the Tsarist occupation government took over Washington. And my third vicious, subversive, and dangerous anarchist quote is, that government is best which governs least. Anybody want to guess which wild-eyed radical said that? Hey, everybody, yeah, most people know that one. Yeah, they don't know the ones from Washington. And so we got our first president, our second president, and our third president all on record as not trusting government. They wrote a constitution which limited the powers of the federal government every way they could think of. They divided the powers up into 3 branches and made it possible for 2 of the branches to counter a third anytime the third got too uppity. Then they put in the 9th Amendment, which says that all powers not specifically designated to the federal government are reserved to the states or the people, which means that they put states' rights as a check on the federal government, and they put the people as a check on states' rights. They didn't trust government at all. Now we are met in a great republic founded by John Fremont in 1847 or 1848. I visited the Fremont Oak, which is where he and his co-conspirators got together and decided to steal California from Mexico. And it's a sort of state monument, the Fremont Oak, where the Bear Flag Rebellion was hatched, in which California declared its independence of Mexico, fought a war with Mexico, achieved its independence, and then applied to join the United States. Some people think that was Fremont's plan all along, was to join the United States, not to have a separate republic here. But be that as it may, I suddenly recalled my travels around this state, and I have noticed more and more every year that from San Diego on north, especially if you're in a car, if you're not flying, you will hear Spanish much more than you will hear English. And this goes on until about San Francisco. When you hit Marin, you start to hear an equal amount of English and Spanish, depending on whether you're talking to the owners or the servants, or the shop owners. By the time you get to Sonoma County, English is a little bit more predominant. What's been happening is the Mexicans have been recapturing California an inch at a time ever since Fremont, which is why all the right-wing talk show hosts are always raving about illegal immigrants. All the raving about illegal immigrants is a disguise to attack legal immigrants, because who knows who's legal and who's illegal? You can't just go up to people and say, can I see your green card? Not unless you work for INS. But it encourages us to suspect everybody with a Mexican complexion, and Mexican features, a Spanish speech. This is because the Anglo oligarchy that rules this state knows damn well the Mexicans are recapturing it inch by inch. I figure 10 years from now, if I'm still wandering around lecturing, it'll be by Mendocino before English becomes the major language, and Spanish will be the major language of the rest of the state. What was that apropos of? Oh yeah, reserving the rights to the states or the people. When the Hispanic population becomes the majority of California, they will probably secede and rejoin Mexico, and then we'll have another civil war. This is just a few pleasant future scans for you to think about and get used to. I just don't have any confidence in the survival of the current form of government we've got since the Constitution was abandoned, the form that I call the czarist occupation government, which began when Reinhard Gehlen and his czarist friends in the KGB went to work for the CIA in the 1940s, and the Gehlen apparat became the major espionage funnel in Europe with its alliance with the Gladio operation in Italy run by the CIA under the directorship of Licio Gelli. Do you remember Gelli? I talked about him 2 days ago. Does anybody's memory go back as far as 2 days? Yeah, they found a bunch of gold buried on his property just a few months ago. Every time you think the pay-due scandals are over, there's a new one. Meanwhile, the major conspirators in the pay-due shenanigans, which involved gun traffic, drug traffic, a lot of illegal activities, and the use of the Banco Ambrosiano, the Vatican Bank, the Cisalpine Bank in the Bahamas, owned by Roberto Calvi, the owner of Banco Ambrosiano, and Archbishop Marcinkus, the president of the Vatican Bank, and the World Finance Corporation in Miami, run by 8 former CIA officers. And if you believe a former CIA officer isn't working for the CIA anymore, I congratulate you on your capacity to maintain a pure and childlike faith in this dark and cynical age. And see me afterwards. I got a bridge I would like to sell you. It runs from Manhattan to Brooklyn, and it's worth a lot of money. You know, I lost track of where I was going. I figure the best thing to do when that happens is to be absolutely honest about it. I was talking about the pay-due conspiracy in Italy, about, they found gold on Licio Gelli's property. Licio Gelli seems to have been the Italian head of the pay-due conspiracy. The American head was James Jesus Angleton, who was the head of counterintelligence for the CIA from its founding. He was in the OSS before he got into the CIA. He was the head of counterintelligence from its founding until 1974, when he was thrown out for interfering in American elections. The CIA, under its charter, nobody has ever objected to it interfering in other people's elections, but Angleton got caught interfering in American elections. You see, Angleton was the architect of what was called the Gladio Project, which involved cooperation between the Gehlen apparat, run by Reinhard Gehlen and his czarist friends in Russia, and the pay-due conspiracy in Italy, run by Licio Gelli, Roberto Calvi, and Michele Sindona. The puppet master behind it all was James Jesus Angleton, who, through Gladio, influenced Italian elections by a variety of techniques. Some of the techniques that have been documented include to start with the trivial and work our way up to the kind of stuff they make movies about. They hired Sophia Loren to do commercials for the politicians they liked. I think that's a pretty good idea. I don't know why they didn't. As a matter of fact, they do that in this country a little bit already, too, don't they? They get good-looking actresses doing commercials for their candidates. Then it went on to bribing candidates to change their politics, to move further from the left and further to the right. And then they assassinated some politicians who could not be persuaded to change their politics. They hired the mafia to do that. And Then they started bombing things at random all over Italy, attributing it to an alleged conspiracy of communist terrorists. These bombings have now pretty clearly been tracked back to the Pay Due crowd under the leadership of James Jesus Angleton back in Langtree, Virginia. James Jesus Angleton not only managed Gladio and Pay Due and the Galen Apparat and the whole czarist, Nazi, fascist wing of the CIA, but he also appears in almost every Kennedy assassination theory. Half of the Kennedy assassination buffs are now convinced Angleton masterminded that job. The other half will have to discuss the theory that Angleton did it, whether they believe it or not, because so much evidence points in his direction. And anyway, when Frank Church, former Senator Frank Church, who was a senator so long ago that nobody remembers him anymore, that was way back in the Dark Ages. Dinosaurs still ruled the earth. Gerald Ford was president. It was the 1970s, and Church did a bunch of hearings on illegal activities by the CIA, in which he exposed a lot of illegal things the CIA was doing, which led to Angleton being fired, and the head of the CIA at the time was fired too, and there was a general overhaul, which was immediately reversed after Ronald Reagan became president and appointed Mad Bill Casey as chief of the CIA, and then everything went back to the way it was under Angleton. But nonetheless, in spite of the opinions of Washington, Adams, and Jefferson, our first three presidents, three of the major architects of the system we once had in this country known as constitutional democracy before the czarist government took over, yeah, I know. I was talking about the czarist takeover, but George, I was talking about the article I sold to the realist, asking whether God was a he, a she, or an it. Imagine my astonishment when on radio one night I heard a historian who just wrote a new biography of George Washington, and he mentioned that, like the other founders of this country, Washington was a deist. The difference between a deist and a theist is that deists don't believe that God can be bribed. All forms of theism are based on techniques to bribe God to do favors for you and destroy or at least confuse your enemies, or at least fuck them over some way or other, but to advance your interest. Deism holds that God created this universe like a magnificent clockwork as described by Sir Isaac Newton, and then let it run by itself and does not perform miracles for anybody, no matter how many bribes you offer. And most of the founders of this country were deists. Most of the intelligentsia of the 18th century were deists. But this historian mentioned something curious about Washington. He said Washington never used the word God in any of his public utterances. And the interviewer was quite taken by that. You mean he deliberately avoided the word? And the historian says, well, it sure seemed that way. But he did use the word providence. And the interviewer said, oh, providence, well, that's sort of like God's will or something. And he said, well, it's a little bit more vague, and Washington deliberately made it more vague because every time he had to use a pronoun, he changed it. He'd say providence in his inscrutable workings, then the next time he had to refer to it, it would be providence in her inscrutable workings, and the next time he had to refer to it, it would be providence in its inscrutable workings. So Washington was just as nutty as me. He wasn't sure whether God was a he, a she, or an it. I much prefer the it theory because it fits my general sense that anything fit to be called a God has got to be beyond all the categories we can think of. There's a Chinese saying, the wise man is Confucian in good times, Buddhist in bad times, and Taoist in old age. Well, I'm old enough to be a Taoist, but actually the second article I sold, Joyce and Taoism, shows that way back in 1959, I was already sympathetic to Taoism, and I was even in my early 20s. I guess I was prematurely old. Taoism has no God. Taoism has the Tao, and any attempt to translate the Tao into English runs into intractable difficulties. We just don't have a concept in English equal to the Tao. I think we might get fairly close to it if we used Washington's word providence and kept changing the pronoun from he to she to it, so we made sure we didn't anthropomorphize it or make it more human or more like ourselves. Kafka wrote a story once about a Great Dane who conceived the idea of God and went around preaching to all the other dogs. And the way the Great Dane described God, God was a bigger dog than any other around here, and he had a dark skin and large paws and a big head. And the more details you get, the more it sounds like a Great Dane. And that sounds like most human concepts of God, doesn't it? I would like to, at this point, repeat the listening exercise, but with a difference. We've been talking about the power of communication, why you should get as many signals as you can. But there are many ways of receiving signals, and receiving verbal signals is only one, which is why Korzybski not only used the word neuro-linguistic, but also the word neurosemantic. Neuro-linguistic refers specifically to how language interacts with our nervous system. Neurosemantic relates to how our nervous system evaluates things with or without language. I would like you to try a simple oriental exercise and a simple occidental adaptation of trying to listen to the sounds again for an unknown period of time, as long as you think it is, and this time try not to put words on them. Just listen to the sounds, don't count them, don't see you can hear the most sounds. Just listen to the sounds and don't name them. If you do find yourself putting names on the sounds, don't feel guilty about it and start a monologue with yourself. Oh, God damn it, I'm putting names on them. Stop putting names on them. Now you're talking to yourself. Shut up, you. I'm trying to do this silently. Well, I guess you've all had enough experience with meditation to know about that dialogue. Hey, I've finally done it. I've stopped thinking in words. Oh, my God, I'm talking about not thinking in words. Everybody here must have had at least one session of Zen Buddhism or some form of Buddhism. Okay, when I say go, just listen and see how many sounds you hear without putting words on them. Okay, go. Now, anybody who feels you're getting high or unusually tranquil or peaceful, hold your hand up. Okay, open your eyes, leave your hands up. Open your eyes and look around. You just had a trance experience without any induction whatsoever. How did that happen? Isn't it amazing what happens when you shut off the verbal centers? Of course, I call this an oriental exercise. That was just to make it a little more palatable. Actually, this exercise was invented by Alfred Korzybski, who never studied Oriental mysticism in his life. He invented this entirely independently. After he discovered the tremendous power that words and other symbols have to control us, he started investigating what would happen if we stopped using words entirely. And he started practicing the meditation. He invented his own meditation technique of trying to sense the world without putting words on it. And I learned it from Ray Bontrager, who learned it from Korzybski. William Burroughs learned it directly from Korzybski. I don't know where Richard Bandler learned it, but he's obviously learned it somewhere or other. The great thing about this exercise is you can do it anywhere. If you're standing online at the bank, waiting your turn, instead of doing the usual monologue, God damn it, if bankers are so smart, why do they have 8 windows and only 2 tellers? Why are the lines so goddamn long? Why do you always have to wait? Is that just so that the hidden cameras can get a good picture of you in case you're a bank robber? Or do they just don't give a damn for their customers? What's that idiot doing up there? What was this? The major financial transaction of the 20th century? When am I going to get to that? And instead of doing all that, if you just go off into listening to the sounds, by the time you get to the window, you're totally blissed out, and you don't notice that you've been uncomfortable at all. You can do it on a bus, you can do it on a trolley, and you can even do it with a goat, I suppose. But no, I suddenly woke up one morning a few years ago, and I couldn't remember the dream, but I remembered some words from the dream. Could you, would you, with a goat? I could not, would not with a goat. I told my wife, I said, geez, I got the weirdest thing in my dream last night. Could you, would you with a goat? I could not, would not with a goat. I said, you know what I think it is? I think by increasing my psychic powers, I picked up on a recording session a couple 100 miles south in L.A. This is Madonna's next record. And I could just picture Madonna singing it. You know, can't you hear Madonna singing, could you, would you with a goat? I could not, would not with a goat, you know. And I was really convinced I got the new Madonna release before anybody else, just through sheer psychic power. Then my wife said, you idiot, that's from Dr. Seuss. It was from one of the books we read to our children about 10 years earlier, which I completely, it's from Green Eggs and Ham. Would you eat green eggs and ham? Could you, would you, Sam, I am? I will not eat green eggs and ham. I will not, could not, Sam, I am. Could you, would you, with a goat? I would not, could not, with a goat. But still, I still think it would make a damn good song from Madonna. Okay, I think now it's time to have a question period again. And comments on what happened during the silence, by the way, what kind of state you got into. I am familiar with cycle theories. There are a lot of them. Most major historical theories seem to be cycle theories. First of all, Guillaume Battista Vico in the 18th century suggested that every society goes through the same cycle, a divine age, a heroic age, and a human age. In the divine age, people think like poets and are sort of in a psychedelic state, although he didn't have that word, the word didn't even exist then, but I think that's what he's describing. Then in the heroic age, a group of bandits, pirates, and other ne'er-do-wells decide to make slaves out of the rest of the human race. They call themselves the heroes, and they call everybody else the plebs or the serfs, and they set about conquering and enslaving and exploiting everybody else. And in the human age, the plebs get together and force a more equitable form of government, which eventually leads to competition between forms of government, which leads to anarchy, which leads to wars, which leads to collapse, which leads back to another divine age. This had a major influence on Hegel, who, being German, couldn't stand the fact that Vico's system was basically poetic, so he made it much more abstract. It became the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis, which later got adopted into Marxist theory. And then Toynbee developed another cycle theory of history. Spengler had his own cycle theory of history. Petrum Sorokin, the head of the Department of Sociology at Harvard, wrote a whole book on his cycle theory. We go through, I don't even remember his ideational, ideological, and I forget what the third, sensational. He liked the ideational the best of all, the ideological second best, and the sensational least of all. We're currently in a sensationalistic age, which is why materialistic science is so important. And everybody likes Picasso's paintings except Sorokin, the sociologist who invented this theory. There are dozens of these cycle theories of history. Brooks Adams, the great-grandson of John Adams, our second president. Brooks Adams was a historian who taught at Harvard. He wrote a book called The Law of Civilization and Decay, in which he argued that every civilization goes through 4 stages. The exploitation of knowledge, in which a priestly group discovers some true knowledge about the universe, like the rising of Sirius behind the sun on July 23rd will be followed by the flood, which will be the right time for planting, or that certain conjunctions of the planets are followed by certain other events here on Earth and so on. And they keep this a secret while they spread a lot of nonsense to the general public. Part of his evidence is that it seemed in the 1890s when he wrote, I don't know what the evidence looks like now, that the Egyptian priests kept hieroglyphics a secret. Nobody knew how to read hieroglyphics except the priests themselves, and I think the royal family. The Mayans seem to have done the same. Mayan script was only known to the priests and the royal family, and nobody else was allowed to decipher it. The second stage, according to Brooks Adams, is the exploitation of force, which is like the heroic age in Vico. That's when a bunch of pirates and bandits get together and set out to conquer everybody else and make slaves out of them. The third stage is the stage of exploitation of land, where the pirates and bandits settle down, divide the land up among themselves, and make everybody else pay tribute for living on the land, apparently under the threat that if we don't pay tribute to them, they'll push us all off the land into the ocean, or something like that. Everybody who's paying rent or a mortgage, either one, you try, what the hell could they do if we all stop paying at once? Can they all push us all into the Atlantic and the Pacific? And where do they have the deed showing that God gave them the earth and disinherited all the rest of us? Well, be that as it may, that's the fourth stage, according to Brooks Adams, is the age of the monopolization of the issue of currency, where kings have the exclusive power to issue currency and then gradually lose it to bankers, because the kings tend to debase the currency, to cheat one another, and people find they can trust bankers more than they can trust kings, so the bankers take over the issue of currency until people find out they can't trust the bankers. At which point Brooks Adams breaks off his theory of the cycles without explaining what happens next. But we seem to be in the fourth stage of Brooks Adams' cycle. Brooks Adams did have some very good ideas in that book. He observed that capital has been moving steadily westward throughout recorded history, which is to say the biggest amounts of capital in private hands have started in Samaria, as far as he knew, then moved to Egypt, then to Rome, then to the northern Italian city-states, then to Paris, then to London. And when he wrote, he said it was hovering between London and New England, and he predicted that by 1950, the center of capital would be between Boston and New York, which turned out to be the truth, which makes him one of the few cycle theorists worth reading, because he did get a few details right. His brother Henry, on the other hand, who also believed that history was following an inverse square law, that every increase in power comes as the inverse square in time of the previous increase in power, so that he predicted that with the discovery of radium by the Curies, by 1917 we'd have infinite power, and by 1922 we'd have enough power to destroy ourselves completely, which he thought we would do. Henry was much more cynical than Brooks. The Adamses are a fabulous family, well worth study. Does that answer your question, or does it just ramble around it? And Joyce includes Vico's cycle theory in Finnegan's Wake, and it's been a debate among Joyce scholars for ever since Finnegan's Wake came out, whether Joyce is using the cycle theory seriously as a proposal, this is the way history really operates, or Joyce is just using it as a joke at the expense of the reader to show that history, if you look at it, seems more like a music hall. It looks more like a Benny Hill or Three Stooges show than it looks like anything rational. Okay, who's next? Ah, yes.
We're on the topic of Joyce. There's a rumor that James Joyce was going to work on the fourth book after Finnegan's Wake. Speculate on what it was about.
Well, Joyce. Well, Joyce dropped a few hints, but there's one thing about James Joyce that's true above all other things. Joyce did not like to explain himself. He liked to leave riddles and puzzles. Most of the remarks he made about Finnegan's Wake seem more like jokes than real aids to the reader. All he said about the next book was that it would be short because Finnegan's Wake was so hard to write. It took 17 years. I've been studying Finnegan's Wake, believe it or not, for half a century, for 50 years. And now I used to be amazed that it took him 17 years to write this book. Now, no other writers I can think of spent 17 years on a single novel. Now my astonishment is that he completed it in 17 years. There's so much in Finnegan's Wake. I don't know how he could do it in 17 years, unless he had 1,000 magical allies on the astral plane helping him or something like that. But anyway, what he said about the next book would be, it would be very short, not as complicated as Finnegan's Wake, very simple, and it would deal with the ocean. And those are the only remarks he made about it. No pages have been found, so apparently he was just thinking about it. He never started writing anything on it. And I can't again resist my temptation to digress. When the Nazis were advancing on Paris, Joyce said to his good friend Samuel Beckett, "Do you think this war makes any sense at all?" And Beckett says, "Yes, I do." And Joyce said, "Well, I don't. I think it's a lot of damn foolishness." And he headed for the Swiss border with his wife and son. And he found himself stuck in southern France, unable to get into Switzerland for a period of about 2 months, until his lawyer finally found out the Swiss were not admitting any Jews fleeing from persecution. And somebody had spread the rumor that James Joyce was Jewish, which somehow is the crowning irony that he, in a life devoted to writing books that, for all their profundity, are most notable for their irony. The fact that everything in Joyce is ironic, tragic, and comic at the same time. That's sort of the way he viewed life. So the fact that a guy who was Irish should be kept out of Switzerland for being Jewish seems like the perfect climax. He finally did get into Switzerland, where he alas died of a perforated ulcer. Yes. Ezra Pound. I have tried to write a paradiso terrestre. Stand still, let the wind speak. That is paradise. May the gods forgive what I have made. May those I love try to forgive what I have made. Those are the last lines of the cantos. I think the rest of it is equally good, but not quite that clear. It requires a little more work to understand. As a matter of fact, that requires a little work to understand if you really start thinking about it. Ovid, Homer, most of the classics end up with brag, this is going to last forever. Pound ends up wondering if anybody can forgive the mess he made. I think the mess is a magnificent mess. Or as Basil Bunting wrote in his poem on the cantos, he compares them to the Alps, and I'm sorry, my memory just gave out. I can't quote any of the lines of the poem that Basil Bunting wrote except the last one. Fools, sit down and wait for them to crumble. I think anybody who waits for the cantos to crumble is going to have as long a wait as those who are waiting for the Alps to crumble. Well, without getting into multiple personality disorder and other psychological controversies, I myself exist in a reality labyrinth. I decide every day which reality tunnel I'm going to go into. Or sometimes I change my mind in the middle of the day. But I always follow the great rule given to me by Timothy Leary, which is open the door to every reality tunnel. But once you open the door, if you look in and there's nobody in there but Nazis and cannibals, close that door and don't go in. But open every door and look in. Yes.
You would be the President of the United States for just 1 week.
The question is, if I were president for 1 week, what changes would I make? One time I took ketamine and became convinced I was God. And I decided I would fix the universe and correct all my mistakes. And then I suddenly realized if I do one thing wrong, I might make the universe even worse than it is. I was thinking especially about the planet Earth, actually. One thing I try to do to fix it is a mistake, I'll screw it up even worse than it is already. Maybe I better think this out. After all, I'm God. I've got infinity to spend thinking it over. So let's take a little while. And then suddenly I realized you're not God at all. You're just tripping your brains out on a goddamn drug. And then I burst into hilarious laughter because it was so obvious that the drug explanation would not account for what I was experiencing here. I took a drug, but that could not explain the fact that I was God. The drug was the approximate cause, but not the efficient cause in medieval terms. And then after I got over being God, I had to find my body, which took a lot of trouble because I knew more or less where it was. But first I had to find the right galaxy, and then I had to hunt around the galaxy for the right solar system, and then the right planet. And then I remembered I was in San Francisco, but I couldn't remember where in San Francisco. And I thought, am I going to have to go through every goddamn building in San Francisco before I find my body again? Then I remembered where it was. And then I was back in my body. Sort of like Chuang Tzu, the great Chinese philosopher, who told his disciples, last night I dreamed I was a butterfly. Now today I am wondering, am I a man who dreamed he was a butterfly, or am I a butterfly who is now dreaming he is a man? And they say he was the most serene individual of his time because not knowing whether he was a butterfly dreaming he was a man or a man who had dreamed he was a butterfly, he wasn't very attached to any belief system at all. And I seem to be dodging and evading your question, don't I? I can't imagine myself as president anymore. I never learned to lie with a straight face, so I don't think I'd ever get to be president. When Kung Fu Tzu, whom the barbarians call Confucius, was asked what was the first thing he would do if he was made emperor, he said, rectify the language. And I guess I would say the same thing. The first thing I would do is order that all school books all be withdrawn, all teachers be retired temporarily, and everybody has to learn the difference between the meta model, the Milton model, and the muddle model, and learn what level they're talking on and not keep confusing themselves and one another. And I'm delighted and surprised to find that I'm in such total agreement with Confucius about that. That's exactly what he said. The Chinese ideograms are Qing and Ming. Qing is an officer, and it generally means rectification, and Ming is the act of speaking, rectify your speech. I don't know much Chinese, but I know a few of the principal ideograms. I feel it's very good to know at least 100 Chinese ideograms. It gets you out of the habit of thinking all the time in Indo-European. I'm also glad I know a little mathematics. I used to know a lot more, but well, that's when I was majoring in mathematics 40 years ago. Now my knowledge of mathematics is about equivalent to my knowledge of Chinese, which is to say I know just enough to see the limitations of Indo-European, but not enough to call myself a Chinese scholar or a mathematician. I'm nowhere near being either. But I'm glad I spent a little time studying each. I think everybody should do something to break the hypnotic trance of Indo-European. Terence McKenna calculated a lot of the trajectories that I've been talking about, the doubling of information, the appearance of novelty and evolution and so on. And he decided it fit a fractal formula, I think the Mandelbrot set, and he concluded that on December 23rd, 2012, knowledge would be doubling every nanosecond, which means 1,000,000 times a second. He referred to that as the encounter with a transcendental object. And what he meant by that, I've never quite figured out. When I try to imagine where the doubling of information is heading, I can see why Terence got rather incoherent in trying to describe it, because I can't quite believe that it's going to double every 1,000,000 times a second. And yet it does continue to accelerate, and I can't see anything that can stop it from continuing to accelerate. So all I can say is hang on, we're in for a rough ride, but it's going to be a lot of fun too, I think. Is that enough of a comment? The Mayan calendar, by the way, does not end in 2012. It starts a new cycle. There's been a lot of oversimplification about the Mayans believed in endless cycles. 2012 just ends the present cycle. Is that an election year? Yeah, it is. Who knows? Maybe we'll have a candidate worth voting for. Well, I mean, you know, with the doubling, with the acceleration of information and the acceleration of social change and so on, maybe Mickey Mouse will run for president, and Mickey, as far as I know, has never done anything dishonorable. I think I would trust him more than any of the candidates that we got around right now. So if Mickey Mouse runs for president in 2012, maybe the Mayan calendar and everything will all come into sync and the whole world will change. And Goofy and Pluto will serve on the cabinet, and Minnie Mouse will be Secretary of Economics. And, well, I can't get much further with that one, so we'll let it drop. Some jokes just don't pan out. You start out hopefully, and you realize you're not getting anywhere. My thoughts on what are my thoughts? Well, I'm here. If I didn't have a high opinion of NLP, I wouldn't be here. You won't find me speaking at any Scientology seminars. You will not find me performing Mass in any Catholic churches. I'm here because I think NLP is one of the most powerful reprogramming devices around. And besides, Richard Bandler is one of the nicest guys I know. And so is his whole staff. God bless them all. Bless them all, bless them all. This, of course, belongs in the area of speculation. But I think the kid who shut down the Pentagon at the beginning of the Gulf War will have a lot of imitators. The people who shut down Amazon.com will have a lot of imitators. But I think something that will be even more widely imitated happened in Germany by a guy whose name the newspapers concealed. It took me a long time to find out why. He was the son of a very rich family, had enough influence to keep his name out of the newspapers. But this guy from his home computer in Hanover managed to get himself into the CIA, the FBI, the White House, the Naval Database in Norfolk, the Lawrence Livermore Labs, where they're inventing super nuclear weapons and ways to kill more and more people faster and faster, and so on. He was into every secure system of the United States government. Unfortunately, instead of putting it up on a website, which would immediately get him busted, but everybody else would be copying it on their websites and it would be all over the world in a hurry, he unfortunately had a love for the white lady, as they call her in Germany, Madame Cocaine. So in order to support his cocaine habit, he was selling all the juicy bits to the KGB. And he was found shot in the woods a few years ago when he was 23 years old. I'm sorry that number comes up again. There's a movie about him called 23, which deals with his computer penetration techniques and with his fascination with the number 23. I appear briefly in the movie as a lecturer saying information should be free, it should flow everywhere. I did not say it should flow to the KGB in return for cocaine, but that was the message he got from me, which shows you there's noise in every communication channel. People don't always hear what you're telling them. They hear what they want to hear. But I didn't mind being in the movie because I think the more government secrets people steal, the better, just as long as they spread them democratically around. The idea of secret government is a diametric contradiction of the idea of a free society. The only way we can have a free society is if we know what the government is doing. How the hell can we have a free society when the government is doing all sorts of things we're not allowed to know about? We don't know what the hell they're doing. Hazel O'Leary, when she was Secretary of Energy, started releasing files on secret experiments the government had conducted on radioactivity using U.S. citizens as unknowing subjects. And pretty soon Clinton persuaded her to resign so he wouldn't have to fire her. And we heard no more about those radiation experiments. We do know about the Tuskegee research, where some black people with syphilis were not treated, but just observed over a period of years to see how the disease would advance without treatment. God knows what else they've been up to. The only way we can possibly have a constitutionally democratic free society is if we know what the government is doing. As a matter of fact, John F. Kennedy said that once, even though he didn't do anything about it. But he said we should have the kind of government where any citizen can walk into any government faculty and say, "What the hell are you doing here?" and get a clear answer. We don't have that kind of government. To pretend we do is the worst lie going around. We got a czarist government that's doing all sorts of things they don't tell us about. We have no idea what they're up to until occasionally an expose comes out. And that is the direct contradiction of the type of government we're theoretically supposed to have. Remember what George Washington said, it's a treacherous servant and a terrible master. So keep this energy, keep the signals flowing. Well, actually, I met Buckminster Fuller in, I forget, 1956, 57, somewhere along around there. And he actually said to me, it sounds like bragging, but I can't resist it. He said, "I admire your verbal facility." And I said, "I wish I had your ideas to be facile about." And then we got talking about lecturing, and he said his technique was never talk about anything unless you've been passionately involved in the study of that subject for 20 years. If you've been passionately involved for 20 years, you don't need notes, you don't need outlines. Just get up and start emptying your brains into the ears of the audience and see how much of it they can digest. And that makes so much sense to me that I never prepare for a lecture. I come in and I see what comes out of what's going on in my head and what I want to discharge to, and I also pay close attention to the audience response. When people start looking bored, I change the subject and switch to something more interesting. But the idea of making note, I have seen so many people dozing off at lectures and staring into space, and because the lecturer has a notebook and he's covering it point by point by point. He's so busy looking down at his notes, he hardly ever makes eye contact with anybody in the audience. And it's no real human communication is happening at all. So I figured Bucky had the right technique, and that's the technique I use. The older I get, the riskier it gets, because there come these sudden pauses when I forget what I'm talking about. And I go through this panic, my God, is that the first symptom of Alzheimer's? But I generally find my way back. That was a funny thing. Everybody was talking about the paperless office in the 70s. And then when the computer revolution hit real big, everything had to be printed out anyway. And my wife was saying, "What do they mean, the paperless office? We got more paper around here than ever." Now it's been months since I printed anything. I got a printer and I never use it. Almost everything goes by email, an attachment to email, or on a floppy disk. And so we really are getting toward a paperless society, which is pretty good considering how fast they're killing trees to keep up the paper production, which they don't have to do, of course. There's no need to kill trees to get paper. You can make good paper out of good, honest hemp. Like our Constitution was written on good, honest hemp. Our Declaration of Independence was written on good, honest hemp. The Magna Carta was written on good, honest hemp. That's why they all have survived, at least as historical documents anyway. Wood pulp paper all falls apart in a while, fairly quickly, as a matter of fact. Hemp paper lasts and lasts and lasts. H.P. Lovecraft, who some of you must have heard of, he got his whole education out of his grandfather's library. I couldn't get an education out of my grandfather's library, even if my grandfather did have a library, because the paper would have all fallen apart by now, since they banned good, honest hemp and substituted this goddamn chemical wood paper. Okay, I think it's getting time to close up shop, and thank you for your polite attendance. And,